Good morning again, everyone. So this is the first masterclass that we're holding, the first masterclass of the Laureates Convention and of today. We are very pleased to have with us Poonam Joshi, and I have some information about Poonam that I wanted to tell you. Poonam is the director of the London office of the Global Human Rights Fund. And before she came to the fund, she worked as a consultant to the Sigrid Rousing Trust and developed the Trust's new grant-making strategy for the Middle East and North Africa. So the fund basically is funding human rights activists around the world. So the perfect person to be running this masterclass, because Poonam has a lot of experience and this is becoming such a topical issue that I think your work is cut out for you there. And she also worked with Amnesty International, whom we all know as UK's expert on women's rights. And she practices family and criminal law in London. For the last 2.5 years, she's played a key role in building a coalition of human rights funders to consider how they can respond more strategically to the closing space, the space that's closing in on activists and advocates as funders and as advocates, because the funders also are affected by this, because it's affecting who they can fund without getting into legal conflicts. So Poonam, thanks so much for joining us. I just want to mention the second masterclass, the material was put out on the table here, which you've picked up. So keep it for the next session. Just know that it doesn't fit this session, but keep it for the next session. And finally, this entire session is being recorded. So for any questions, please wait until you receive the hand mic. All right, so we have now about an hour, a little under an hour and a half. Poonam will begin, and then we will have a nice, very active discussion. So Poonam, thank you very much. We're honored and privileged to have you here, and look forward to this session.
Yeah. Can everyone hear me at the back? Great. Just before I start the presentation, I have a terrible relationship with any kind of tech, so even slides are sometimes beyond me, so just bear with me. I hope I get this in the right order. So Virginia, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at the conference, and I know that last night you all took a moment to remember Berta Cáceres, the Honduran environmental activist and one of your fellow laureates. And at the fund, Berta's organization, COPIN, was one of the ones that we've also been funding for many years. Her colleague Gustav Castro Soto, who was with her when she was killed and who is now being prevented from leaving Honduras, his organization in Mexico, Otros Mundos, is also one of our grantees. So although we're a human rights funder, many of those whom we fund are at the intersection of environmental and human rights, and many of those are some of your colleagues and peers. And this discussion seems even more timely and relevant than it did a week ago, given Berta's terrible killing. And one of the things I hope we're going to look at today is how do we respond to threats like that. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start off with an introduction just to kind of set the scene on the trend of what we call here the closing space, which is a term that was coined by an expert at Carnegie Endowment and Peace who wrote a report on this in 2014. And I think it's a trend that all of us were experiencing in our kind of silos, but that report was the first one to kind of make the link and turn it, transform our understanding of it being a global trend. I'm going to also take you through some country case studies to show how this is playing out in different ways. Berta's death is one extreme of the continuum, but there are many more subtle ways that governments and corporations are closing down the space for environmental actors and human rights actors to operate. And then we're going to open up for a discussion session to see what your experience is, then return to something hopefully more positive, which is looking at strategies and how do we respond, and once again open it up to all of you to hear what kind of strategies that you're coming up with, but also if there might be new ideas and new strategies that I could share with you. So I'm going to very quickly just give you an overview of what the fund does. So we were set up in 2002 by a group of human rights funders in the US and Europe who wanted to move resources to grassroots activists emerging across the global south. So many of these were big human rights funders who funded the kind of Western international human rights organizations, but we're seeing activists emerging on the ground. Some of them didn't look like traditional human rights activists, partly because many of them were environmental actors who were starting to hold their governments and corporations to account. And so we were established to fund those groups. As of last year, we fund over 300 human rights organizations across the global south, from Latin America, Middle East, North Africa, Africa, South and Southeast Asia. And I'd say around 60 plus of those organizations are land and resource rights activists, and they're engaged in struggles around forced displacement to make way for extractives, infrastructure, energy projects. And I think partly because of that, and that's a growing portfolio for us across all of the regions in which we fund, the phenomena of the closing space came to our attention sort of very early on, because it came to us through the attention of our grantees saying we're facing increasing protection and security threats, but also we're starting to grapple with legislation that we don't completely understand that affects our ability to register and operate, and what do we do? So the fund has been part of a coalition of human rights funders. We set up something called the Donor Working Group on Cross-Border Philanthropy, but actually our focus goes way beyond foreign funding and how to get funds across borders. And so at the moment there are 45 private human rights funders. What we do is we try to inform the human rights sector about the trend, how to navigate legal restrictions so you can continue to support activists on the ground. We're also engaged in advocacy, but one of the things we're doing is also reaching out to other civil society actors, because one of the things that we've learned very early on is this phenomena is so large and so great in scale that you need to have allies. And there are things that we can do united that we can't do separately. So the aim of the discussion today is threefold. One, I'm going to provide you with the broader context for what this phenomena is, and the nature and the scale of the restrictions, and what that impact might be on environmental actors. I think much of that you'll be familiar with. There'll be other dimensions you might not be. The second is I want to enable you to understand the drivers and the potential levers and alliances that might be open to environmental actors. When I say drivers, I mean what's driving this trend. And I think many of you will experience this trend in the context of your own country, but may not have realized that there are kind of global dimensions and global drivers, and therefore global actors that you might be able to engage with. The final thing that I want to do is really learn from you. From me as a human rights funder that's working on this issue, I really want to understand how environmental actors are affected, but also some of the strategies that you're using. So it's very much an opportunity for me to learn from you and us to learn from each other. So in terms of setting the scene, I think one of the questions I get asked frequently is human rights activism or environmental activism has never been without risk. And activists have been subjected to harassment, threats, and violence for many years. And part of the function of the awards, the environmental awards, is to raise the profile of activists and also give them a degree of protection alongside the recognition. So I get asked, what's new? And before I sort of go into what's new, I just want to define what we mean by the closing space. So what we're talking about is a phenomena of attacks that are taking place simultaneously, restricting the right to protest, expression, that includes online expression. It restricts the right of groups to form and register and associate. It can lead to the criminalization of human rights and environmental activists. It also includes defamation and harassment campaigns that are led by governments, but they could be led by other actors for example, corporations, but in many of the contexts we work, it's also religious and conservative groups, for example, or xenophobic movements. And of course, some of these laws primarily impact not-for-profit organizations and NGOs, but the reality is they affect the space for all forms of debate and dissent. So those could be very individual acts of expression to the work of mass movement to registered organizations. So in terms of, what is new then? I think the first thing is we know that those sort of risks to physical security have always been there, but what we now know is that's increasing. We did our own survey of over 100 of the groups that we fund in 2014, and they all reported an increase in the use of smear attacks, illicit surveillance, arbitrary arrest, office raids, physical assault, and even death threats. And I remember the common thread across all of these were, we fund women's rights activists, children's rights, transparency campaigners, LGBT groups, but right across the board, they all reported that this increase was primarily directed at land and resource rights and labor rights activists. So very much kind of operating in the space that many of you are. And last year, Global Witness produced a report that had documented the killing of 116 environmental activists across 17 countries. The highest numbers were reported in Brazil. The highest per capita death rate was for environmental activists in Honduras. And in that sense, Berta's death might have come as a shock to those outside of the environmental movement in Honduras, but for those within it, it was expected. And I know one of the things my colleague who works on Latin America, who is a friend of Berta's, said was that her colleagues had a eulogy prepared for her because it was just a question of when. And what Global Witness found was that over the kind of previous year, there'd been a marked 20% increase in such killings. So that's one of the new dimensions, is the intensity and the scale is increasing. But then alongside that, there's the other aspect, was the newest dimension of the closing space, which is this proliferation of laws that try to restrict the registration and operation of NGOs. And those are being accompanied by smear attacks. And those two things combined delegitimize environmental and human rights activists, and they close the space for engagement and mobilization and dissent. And civil society experts who've been monitoring civil society for over 25 years are describing this as the greatest threat facing NGOs for a generation. The final thing I wanted to say was, as I said, this is a phenomena that's affecting human rights activists and environmental activists. It's also affecting development and humanitarian actors too. And I can talk more about that later. And in terms of, how it's happening, so on the kind of legal side, in terms of expression and dissent, you see governments using legislation, old legislation like sedition and treason legislation, but also new laws to curb media and internet freedoms, and laws prohibiting the expression of specific kinds of content with regards to freedom of assembly. You see anti-terrorism laws being used to criminalize protesters, and I'll talk more about that in the context of environmental actors in a moment. And you also, in terms of those forms of legislation, Civicus documented that in the last couple of years, 96 countries had taken steps to inhibit NGOs from operating at their full capacity. I'm sure that many of you use these strategies, but many of the activists that we fund use all of the strategies that I've just described. They use mass protests, they use rallies, they use human rights education, they use communications, they use social media to get the word out. So imagine if there's a proliferation of laws coming in, restricting your ability to do all of those things, and not just restricting it, but criminalizing you for doing it. But what I'm going to focus on in this presentation is particularly the use of NGO laws. So since January 2012, more than 100 laws have been proposed or enacted by governments around the globe that are aimed at restricting the registration, operation, and funding, and that's particularly cross-border funding, of NGOs. That phenomena in terms of its scale is not just the usual suspects. It's not just Russia and Egypt and Azerbaijan, as you might expect. It's also spreading to countries with better democratic credentials. Hungary, which is a member of the European Union, India, Canada, which is one of the case studies I'm going to be coming up with, even the UK. However, in that global context, the reality is it's countries in Africa and Asia that are hardest hit, and former Soviet Union. And so what's in this for governments? I mean, the reality is when governments or corporations use physical force against activists, it's going to invoke condemnation. And we see that in the aftermath of Berta's death, is that there's a global outcry and at least an attempt to shed a spotlight on what's happening in Honduras. What the NGO laws do is give governments a much more subtle way of paralyzing civil society groups without invoking the same kind of condemnation. I mean, the reality is that actually many of the groups that we fund are not even aware of the implications of a lot of this legislation as it's being proposed. They're not experts on freedom of association. I'm guessing most of you are not experts on freedom of association. So if you hear that, I don't know, a tax law is or there are tax regulations coming in, or there's something to do with registration of NGOs, given how involved you are in your other struggles, this is not going to be a law that's going to be on your radar. They often look quite sort of bland on the surface. And they take activists by surprise. And the reality is, NGO law removes tax perks for charities is not going to be a global headline in the way that, a killing or mass arrests will be. And what we find in the picture I've got here is actually from Hungary, is these laws are used to administratively harass activists, and that harassment is often accompanied and actually preceded and accompanied by defamation campaigns that smear human rights and environmental activists as being foreign agents. It smears their donors as being actors who are trying to subvert the sovereignty or security or traditions of that country. And receipt of foreign funding is being used as one of the key ways now that governments are trying to discredit activists. For those of you who are laureates or engaged in environmental activism, how many of you receive funding from outside of your country to do the work that you do? If you could put your hand up. Okay, the hands are starting to go up. I mean, certainly from the conversations I had last night was that the reality is, very little of the work that environmental activists do is funded from within their own country. So it's very dependent on funding, often from Western funders. So if that funding flow is cut off, it threatens to shut down the work. So what are the drivers? Sorry, I missed a couple of slides. See, I told you. What are the drivers behind this trend? The drivers are complex. Different ones apply in different countries. Not all of these are going to be relevant in each country context, but I'd be very interested when we open up for discussion, which one of these drivers sort of resonate with you. So the first is an increasing suspicion by governments of Western agendas on democracy and human rights. I mean, the vast majority of funding on democracy and human rights, and I don't know what the situation is on environmental activism, so it'd be interesting to hear that, has come from Western governments, not private human rights funders, Western governments, US, EU, UK, Norwegians, Swedes, etc. And I think following the interventions of the UK and the US in Afghanistan and Iraq, what we saw was a growing suspicion about what the real intentions were behind the funding. And you had George Bush using, the language of democracy and human rights to justify those interventions. So suddenly, what just seemed like a sort of benign strand of funding of local civil society suddenly takes on a different dimension. At the same time, what you also have is an increasing relativization of political values. There was a sense that the globe was largely sort of moving towards becoming increasingly democratic and respecting of rights. What you've seen in the last decade is a number of governments saying, democracy is not the right model for our country. Human rights aren't universal. And so those of you who try and work on these values in our countries are actually imposing something foreign, something Western. You have the rise of people power, and one of the experts who writes about the closing space has written about, it's every autocrat's worst nightmare to wake up and find 100,000 of your citizens outside the presidential palace. And, the reality is that the series of revolutions across the Middle East, North Africa, although they've been sort of stymied and stifled and many of those revolutions have failed, popular protest continues to be a massively powerful way of undermining and disrupting government power. We've seen it most recently in Guatemala last year, where it brought down the government. So what you have is governments genuinely fearful of mass protest and seeing environmental and human rights actors as being some of the players that are kind of feeding that mobilization and dissent. We see a conflation of NGOs being viewed as the political opposition. So I think you see this in a number of countries. We've seen this particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and increasingly in Asia, where you have governments that have been in power for a very long time. The political opposition is very weak. The judiciary is weak. The media isn't free. And civil society, and this includes environmental actors, are some of the few actors in the country still trying to hold the government to account. And so what you see is the government starting to smear what we would see as just independent civil society activity as political. That language is used, for example, in Russia, but the term political used in a very, very negative way to imply that these are actors who have an agenda to secure access to power, that they're not genuinely independent and concerned about rights, that they have their own agenda. And perhaps that agenda is also backed by the agenda of foreign corporations or governments who want to destabilize that country. The next point is around counterterrorism laws post 9/11. And after 9/11, there was a proliferation of anti-terror legislation, particularly pushed by the UN and the US. One of the dimensions of that has been the introduction of global standards around stopping terrorist financing. And that legislation, I'm not going to go into it now, but it affects all of you. Every one of you, your government is signed up to these global standards. The global standards say that civil society actors are particularly vulnerable to being used as a conduit for terrorist financing. And that's been one of the drivers in terms of closing the regulatory space. But I would imagine that, anti-terrorism laws are not one of the laws that you probably think of as being very relevant to the work that you do. So I want to give you two examples. So just last month, Brazil passed an anti-terror bill, and the human rights activists that we've been working with in Brazil expect that law to be used to crack down on protests by environmental movements across the country. That's the first example. The second one is Paris. So in the aftermath of the Paris attacks, the government introduced sweeping emergency powers. Where were they used? Well, they used early on in Paris in December to limit the public demonstrations around the Global Climate Conference. So you see very easily legislation that you might think has absolutely nothing to do with you being used to justify closing the space for you to be able to do your work. Then the final point I'm going to raise is the development agenda, also one that many of you probably don't think has anything to do with the work that you have to do. And one of the things we've seen over recent years is the Western governments that were providing aid responding to criticism from the recipient governments that it shouldn't just be a sort of donor-beneficiary relationship. So frameworks were introduced to give the recipient governments like Ethiopia, like Rwanda, more control over how that money is spent. But what they've done with those frameworks is say, we get to control which civil society organizations use this money. And so the idea of an independent civil society working with governments to work on development goals has sort of disappeared. And what we see in its place is some of the most restrictive countries in the world, like Ethiopia and Rwanda, still receiving huge flows of foreign aid, but controlling who it goes to. And in terms of why it's relevant for you is the Sustainable Development Goals. So now there are 4 goals in the Sustainable Development Goals around clean energy, around climate action, around halting environmental degradation, and preserving marine and coastal biodiversity. And so, you know, knowing where governments stand on the independence of civil society in the delivery of these goals is going to be crucial. You know, perhaps your governments won't comply with human rights obligations and standards. The Sustainable Development Goals are goals, and it's going to be a framework that they take very, very seriously, and they're going to be measured on their progress. And all of you are actually vital allies for them in that work, even if they don't see it that way. So I'm just going to go into 3 case studies. I'm going to start off with Canada. So I've decided to sort of move along the kind of continuum of how this phenomena is playing out. And I'm going to try and do it as quickly as possible just because of time. So I had a few conversations last night, and when I mentioned Canada, people's eyebrows were raised, and they were like, really? Canada? So I think those of you, is anyone in the room from Canada? No. Any of you very familiar with what's been happening in Canada for the last decade or so? A little bit. So those of you who are sort of familiar will know that the Stephen Harper administration was one that was not friendly to civil society in any way. But I think that reputation that Canada has developed over decades of being a champion of human rights and environmental rights is still there. So most of us are not really aware of what's been going on. So what happened in 2012 in Canada? What we saw was that environmental groups that had been instrumental in mobilizing opposition to the government plans to extract oil from tar sands came under attack. So the tar sands expansion was a central plank of the Harper administration's agenda on the economy. And so what did they do? They took on these environmental activists using a number of strategies. So they used administrative harassment. And they instructed the Senate Finance Committee in Canada to investigate how these environmental groups were using their funding. There's legislation in Canada that puts a 10% cap on the money that you can spend on lobbying. So these organizations were audited. So imagine a government committee coming and going through every receipt of everything you've spent over the last 5 years. It's not the same as an office raid or being arrested, but what those environmental activists reported was that their work was completely paralyzed. What the government also did was begin a campaign of smear attacks linking environmental activism to terrorism. So what I have here is an excerpt from the Canadian Counter-Terrorism Strategy from 2012. So it says, although not of the same scope and scale faced by other countries, low-level violence by domestic issue-based groups remains a reality in Canada. And if you go down a little further, the groups that they're talking about are animal rights, white supremacy, environmentalism, and anti-capitalism. Now, this is in a context, I mean, as I say, sort of further down the line. So this document discussed environmentalists who had no record of using violence in Canada alongside the Oklahoma City bombing and the 2011 Norway massacre as examples of domestic issue-based extremism. Now, the reality is we know that this is ridiculous, but what we also see is if governments do this enough and kind of drip feed this kind of rhetoric and these kind of labels about a group, when they then go after them with NGO laws, the public support that these groups previously had has eroded, and their legitimacy has eroded. And the reality is pushing the buttons on something like terrorism and security is incredibly effective because it sort of responds to a fundamental concern all of us have about safety and security. We want our government's approach on terrorism to be zero risk. And so if there's even the slightest bit of risk that these kinds of groups are engaged in threatening our security, we distance ourselves from them. So I'm going to go back to India. So kind of next on that continuum, I mean, India is regarded as being the world's largest democracy. But what we've seen in India over the last decade is the government using a range of legislation to crack down on environmental activists. So around 2012, we saw the previous left-of-centre government using legislation introduced by actually the British Empire around sedition to arrest and charge 9,000 protesters for sedition because of their opposition to the introduction of nuclear reactor in southern India. So I think this is where you start seeing it's not just about sort of human rights or land and resource rights activists, but also the nuclear-free movement coming under attack. And they've been one of the primary targets of the Indian government over the last decade. And this was a movement which is predominantly coastal communities who are fighting the introduction of a reactor from Russia where experts have raised serious concerns about the potential safety of this reactor. So you have communities responding to an existential threat, as they see it, to their survival, and the government cracking down using security. A couple of years ago, there was a change of government in India. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the new government. The new Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, is a member of Hindu right-wing political party called the BJP. He is, by virtue of his track record, known as somebody who is anti-democratic and quite autocratic in the way that he works. And he was elected on an agenda of economic growth. And what he's been trying to do since 2014 is to dismantle the framework of environmental protections in the country and labor rights protections. So, for him, the environmental movement is a key obstacle to realizing those goals. So a month after he was elected in June 2014, the Indian Intelligence Bureau leaked a report. And in that report, the Bureau said that over 100 environmental and resource rights groups in the country were receiving foreign funding to carry out goals that were anti-development and anti-Indian. They accused these NGOs, and these were groups that were working around extractives, nuclear, and GM products, of reducing India's GDP by 2 to 3%. I mean, it was laughable. I think, once again, like the Canadian context, you don't have to be an economist to realize how ridiculous that is. And frankly, as a human rights funders, if our groups really were that impactful, we would be so pleased. But, the reality is the groups that we fund don't have the ability or the power to reduce India's GDP in that way. But what it did was it led to a media frenzy that put the NGOs in the dock and on the defensive, and the Greenpeace India was in particular a target of that. So this is a screenshot from a news debate. And I remember, following the issue at the time, and on a daily basis on numerous TV channels, you basically, you had titles like NGOs in the dock. Are they reducing India's GDP? Greenpeace India has now shut down as a result of successive legal attacks and smear attacks. And we see a situation, I mean, just to give you an anecdotal example of how this plays out personally, our program officer in India, when she went to apply for a personal loan, was asked who she worked for, and when she said she worked for an NGO, they basically denied her a personal loan. I remember speaking to the director of Greenpeace India, who was saying their staff were now being asked by their landlords, did they have something to do with Greenpeace India? And we're getting very, very worried and asking them to leave their homes. So these are some of the very, very subtle ways. Yes, of course, office raids and arrests and attacks, shut down our ability to do our work. But when your staff is unable to just operate on a day-to-day basis, it's so subtle, it's so clever, it's never going to make a headline. NGO worker denied loan. NGO worker loses home. So it would be interesting to see how this is playing out in your context. The final case study is Russia, and I'm so pleased we have Oleg here today, and we have other Russia experts, including Paul Walker here today as well. So for me, it was interesting. I mean, Russia's a context I'm less familiar with, and I had the opportunity to speak with Paul and Oleg last night, and I was asking them, what the history's been of the relationship between environmental actors and the Russian authorities. And they both spoke about a context in which there had been space in the 80s and 90s to engage on this work. Not always without difficulties, but there was an openness and there was an ability to engage with activists on the ground and engage communities on this issue. And Paul was saying that it became very problematic for his organization, Green Costs, from 2008 onwards. I'm going to come into this at around 2012, but Paul, perhaps when we have the open discussion, you could talk more about what was happening around 2008 to trigger this. But what you see in 2012, after Vladimir Putin was elected as president for a third term, was his government introducing a series of amendments to existing NGO laws on the grounds that civil society groups needed to be more transparent and accountable, which is also a justification that's being used by governments globally to introduce NGO laws. So under this law, activities including seeking policy reform or influencing public opinion are now labeled as being political. And any groups engaged in political activities are required to register as foreign agents. As a result of that, they're vulnerable to being harassed by the state through a system of onerous reporting and audits. But I think also there again, it's the rhetoric, foreign agents. I mean, so damning and so toxic. And a failure to register would result in a number of implications, including hefty fines. And I know, Oleg, this is something that you can talk about in detail. And so what we've seen is both local and federal authorities in Russia using the law, especially since 2014, to subject NGOs to pressure, intimidation, harassment, and smear campaigns. In relation to environmental groups, we've seen local political and business interests use the law as a way to advance their own interests. So, for example, local businessmen using the law to get environmentalists who are viewed as a barrier to their plans, whether it be halting the construction of a waste incinerator or a nuclear power plant or a highway through a national park, they can use this law to discredit and shut down that accountability and opposition. And in the context of the environmental laureates, two of the laureates who've been working on nuclear energy have been particularly a target of this law. So Oleg, I hope when we kind of finish this first bit, you'll talk about your experience with your NGO, Green World. And Oleg was telling me last night that the authorities have said that his organization is a foreign agent, that they want him to register because Oleg has been resisting that registration quite rightfully. They're now taking it through the courts because the authorities have wanted to oppose, was it an €8,000 fine on your organization for not registering as a foreign agent, which would cripple Green World. The other case I wanted to talk to you about was another laureate. And my pronunciation of names I've been trying to pronounce. In fact, could somebody do it for me and then I can copy it? Paul. Nadezhda. I've been trying to say this in a beautiful Russian accent, and I don't have a beautiful Russian accent. So, but Nadezhda's been the target of attack. So I'm going to sort of just take you through what happened to her and explain why she's not here today, though I know there is a message from her colleague that we'll hear today. So on the 1st of June 2015, a film was screened about Nadezhda on a national Russian news channel. And basically, she was accused of wanting to close down. It's a nuclear plant that operates in a closed town, and I'll let Oleg explain the context of that a little bit more. And the news report said that her goals strangely correspond to the wishes of Western countries and competitors. Without doubt, her actions are a threat. So this is, Nadezhda is a mother of four who works at looking at the impact of the nuclear industry on the public health and the lives of the communities that surround a particular closed town. Her work in most contexts would be seen as being focused on public health, but what she's been accused of is actually industrial espionage. And as a result of that, Nadezhda and her family had to leave Russia, and they sought asylum in France, which is where she is right now. And because she's an asylum seeker, she doesn't have access to her immigration papers, and that's the reason that she's not able to join us today. But I thought Nadezhda's comment on the Russian media attacks was sort of dryly funny in response to what she was facing. And what she said was, "We make a strange nest of spies. Our staff of 4 is made up of single mothers and a pensioner who became an invalid after working on the Chernobyl cleanup. I can't think of a less likely fifth column." And it's great to see that she still has humor, however bleak, in the context of what she's facing. But I know I've been in email contact with her in the last week. But the reality is she feared a serious threat to her liberty and her life. And she had to leave the country, which effectively means that the work of her organization is shut down. And I was talking to Paul about this last night. What does it mean when this work gets shut down? It means that down the line, there's likely to be an environmental disaster in Russia, maybe many, that will affect people's lives, that will affect people's health. And in many ways, I'd say many of you are on a stronger footing compared to the work that we fund on human rights funders. For us, it's sometimes very hard to make the case for LGBT activism or working around violence against women, but the work that you do is so fundamental to the well-being and survival of the communities in which you are. One of the things I hope we can think about is what's the rhetoric that we can mount in response to what the governments are doing. I'm going to just very briefly say, before we move to questions, that I know a number of the other laureates have also faced harassment and attacks. One of them is with us in the room, which is Golden, Ms. Abiko from DRC. And Golden's organization works around environmental issues related to the nuclear industry in DRC. And Golden was detained in 2009 and only released after public pressure. And I hope Golden will have an opportunity to discuss some of his experiences. So what I want to do, how are we doing on time? Good. Okay. Is take 15 to 20 minutes to really open up. Oh, not that good. Okay. How about 5 minutes?
What's your plan?
After this, I'm just going to very briefly run through some strategies. So most of my presentation is done.
Okay. But we have about 40 minutes left.
Okay, that's fine. So if we take 10 minutes to talk about this and then focus on strategies, and I'm just going to be speaking for 2 or 3 minutes. I wanted to ask all of you in the room a number of questions. The first one was, do you recognize your experience in this phenomena, the phenomena that I've described? Does this resonate with what you're experiencing or the groups that you work with on the ground are experiencing? If so, I'd really like to hear from you about how it's affecting you and your ability to do your work. I'd like to have a better understanding of what you feel are the root causes behind the closing space that you're experiencing. And actually one of the drivers I didn't talk about, because it kind of runs through the whole presentation, is the complicity of corporations and governments in shutting down the space because of their own economic interests and agendas. And then finally, I want to see if we can start looking at if there are gaps in our understanding of how the space for environmental actors to operate is under attack. My sense is, although this is an issue that you're familiar with, you probably haven't kind of looked at it in a global context, in the context of what's happening to civil society as a whole, and you probably recognize some aspects of it, the most serious aspects, in terms of killings and harassments and raids, but perhaps some of those kind of more subtle forms around legal restrictions might not be something that you've recognized as part of this phenomena. So what I'm going to ask you to do actually is just for 2 minutes, if you could speak to the person next to you, or if you're in a group of 3, speak to the people either side. Has that just moved? Hang on. If you could particularly sort of look at question 1 and 2. Do you recognize this experience? Is it affecting you and the ability to do your work? So if you just speak to the person next to you just for 2 minutes, and then we'll bring it back, and I'd like to hear your experiences. Okay. Okay. Okay, could everyone just bring their conversations to a close? I might need your help, Virginia.
Everybody, I know everybody's now getting into the discussions, but we need to come back to the plenary group.
Okay. I mean, it's always a good sign, but also a negative sign when the discussion becomes so intense on this issue. So before we kind of look at these second two questions, I just wanted to get a flavor of the discussions that you've been having around the room. So if people could sort of put their hand up and volunteer to speak, not just about their own experience, but the discussion they've been having. Thank you.
My name is Cornelia. I'm from Switzerland, which actually is a democracy as we understand it. And in Switzerland, it's very subtle, as you said. I paid everything myself because I knew otherwise I could not speak up or say what I think. And my major, or one of my major thoughts is that even in Switzerland we have no independent universities, which means that sort of the people in our governments that went to through our schools, they're infiltrated mentally. And I think we should really make a change in our educational system and universities, that people become more open when they get out of school and are more aware and not so much afraid that if they would use a word like low radiation or something, that they are afraid to lose their jobs, you know.
Thank you. Thank you. And I would be very interested to hear from those of you from countries that we don't think of as being the usual suspects on this. I know there were a couple of people across here, and there's somebody at the back. Okay.
Okay, I was just asked to bring my example. I work in the Philippines and with people with disabilities, reforesting, and they face problems in the Philippines with registration of their cooperatives, and it's delayed because of very unclear reasons. They need some extra papers, etc. So it's just you can't really understand why it isn't proceeding in the registration, and it's just they're keeping us on standby mode for a long time, and with other groups it's quicker. But I think you want the example in Germany. I work for an NGO in Germany as well, and we have this non-profit status, and the government really can threat us by telling us, yeah, well, you won't have this status anymore because you're politically active.
Yes.
And you won't have your tax exemptions anymore, so nobody will donate anything anymore.
And so this is exactly fits into this continuum, actually, both of the examples. So we found a lot of the groups that we support, what they assumed were just bureaucratic hurdles were actually politically motivated, but also the example of Germany, which has until now been used as good practice. So when we go to meetings about the closing space, one of the things people ask us is, well, what does an enabling environment for activism look like? And people often use the example of Germany, but can't any longer. And that, of course, there's a big difference between Germany and Russia, but that use of the word, the use of the label political, you see kind of passing from country to country. I think if we take one more on this side and then a couple on this, and then we return to these questions.
Yeah, in terms of Germany, it seems that this has been a nice practice, because it seems that the law that non-profit organizations are not supposed to work politically is old, but it hasn't been used, it hasn't been applied. But recently, the very known German non-profit ATTAC has been removed from being a non-profit, which is really, really hampering. And they're anti-TIP and CETA, anti-globalization activists. And so, yeah, this is going to change the field.
It's very worrying.
Thanks. And we have Regine Richter here from Urgewald, which is also working in the area. Did you want to say something quick?
Maybe that goes to strategies, because, I mean, this problem we face now with ATTAC and other organizations in Germany being under attack on their political work as what you would call charities. I mean, there is a big coalition now forming of organizations trying to exactly fight this this legal bit where it said, if you want to be a charity, you can't do political work. And going back to, look, this is really old legislation and it can't be, and it's the wrong approach. So I think there is something like a proactive approach towards this, trying to shrink the space.
Yes. And we're going to be talking about strategies in a minute. I think if we just take these two, I think later I would like to come back to actually both Oleg and Golden, who've been on receiving end of quite terrible problems in this context, but we'll come back to that in a minute.
Okay, I'm Samson from Ethiopia, country director for Solar Foundation.
Yes.
In our case, NGOs are not really friend of the government at the moment. All procedures become different every day, and the office or responsible office is not really responsive for any even for a re-registration. It's become corrupted. We have to, NGOs have to pay a lot of money to get kind of permissions for expatriates to come for the NGO activities. To re-register, we have to talk to the guys in the office and give some money to re-register if we want to continue. Mm-hmm. And the other big problem is there is two categories. There are two categories now. One is the international NGOs and one is the local NGOs. Local NGOs are only allowed to get 10% of their activity from abroad. The remain should be collected from local, which is impossible in Ethiopia. Yeah. For international NGOs, it is possible, but they are limited. They cannot do a kind of advocacy activities or other kind of activities, not allowed. Yeah. Many NGOs closed at the moment, and we at Solar Foundation also are close to close now, maybe in a few months.
I was going to say Ethiopia introduced legislation in 2009, the CSO Proclamation Act, and it's probably the most restrictive piece of legislation around NGOs globally, and certainly in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa. And a number of other countries, Kenya, Uganda, have tried to use actually copycat the legislation from Ethiopia. So I'd be very interested to hear how you're responding to that, because to us, Ethiopia is essentially a closed space now for human rights activism, but there are still development and environmental actors trying to work there. I'm going to take just this one final comment, and then I'm going to sort of just have a couple of minutes on these last two questions. So if you could go ahead.
Okay. In the UK, there are quite a few local community-based action groups wanting to install the renewable energy that they fund locally, and this has been encouraged by government over the last 5 years, and so quite a lot of these little community renewable energy groups have grown up. But now, politicians interfere, and you don't have stability, so all the tax benefits and the feed-in tariff, all the things that sort of gave the business model for local community energy have just been taken away by the government. So it's very difficult to operate in a political environment. You try and do things, but politics constantly interferes.
Absolutely. Thank you. I just wanted to move on to this third question about what the drivers are. And Oleg, I wanted to come to you. Maybe you could speak a little bit about your experience, but also, what do you think is the driving cause between the problems that you're experiencing right now? I mean, a lot of us will have a particular perception of the Russian state and Putin, but it would be interesting to have perhaps a more sophisticated analysis from those of you who are experts in Russia, and help us to understand why this is affecting your organization in this way at this time, given how many years you've operated. Should I give? I think just a couple of minutes, and then I hope to hear more from you when we speak about strategies.
You need to use the mic, Oleg.
My name is Oleg Bodrov. I'm physicist and ecologist in the same time. More than 27 years, I am NGO activist. And I live in the close nuclear town, Sosnovy Bor, 40 kilometers from St. Petersburg, on the coastline of the Baltic Sea. It is the biggest nuclear cluster. There are 9 nuclear reactors, military and civil, and 4 nuclear reactors under construction. And 2 months ago, the Ministry of Justice nominated our organization like foreign agent. Why did they do this? Because we are very strong criticism of the nuclear industry, and according to the Russian government and the Russian president, we act against Russian national interests, because Russia have ambitions to construct nuclear power plant to another country, but we show that it is really dangerous and why did. And it is not emotions, because we have some documents and facts, and we show this. And the Ministry of Justice asked to pay 8,000 euros like fee, because we not registered like foreign agent voluntarily. And just after this conference will be next court, and we appeal that we don't want to pay this. And what can we do in this case? The main ambitions of the Russian nuclear industry to export nuclear technology and import the spent fuel rods. And it's looked like very good business. When Germany and other European countries stop the nuclear development, Russia have a strategy to construct new nuclear power plant close to the Europe and export nuclear electricity. And we show that it is dangerous not only for the Europe, but for the Russia too. More detail I will say when will be my presentation after the lunch. And what can we do in this case? Reasonable, I think, we need to cooperate, endure between Russia and the country which will be consumers of the nuclear electricity. And only when we will create some network, international network, reasonable to provide information to show the people in this country what will happen. And we already produced some documentaries, like some brochures, and we will be ready to present this documentation for all our colleagues. And I think a reasonable main strategy for NGO to establish new connections and to provide information exchange and to show why it is a bad idea. This is my vision.
Thank you very much. Shall I, just on the final question, I'm very, very conscious of time. I'm actually just going to turn to somebody, actually, Paul. I'm going to come to you, someone who works at Green Cross and has a sort of both an overview of what's been happening over the last couple of decades, but what's been happening globally, not just in terms of the anti-nuclear movement, but other environmental movements. And do you feel that we have a comprehensive understanding of how environmental actors are being affected, or do you think there are gaps in our understanding of the space that there is for environmental actors to operate?
Yeah, thanks, Poonam. I'm Paul Walker with the Green Cross International out of Geneva, Switzerland, although my office is actually in Washington, D.C. I'm an American. I think there are still gaps in understanding it. We operate in a wide variety of countries, but the place where I've operated most is in the United States for years, but also in Russia, the former Soviet Union, as Oleg Badrov knows well. And a lot of the work we've done over the years has been in helping to facilitate the safe and sound and irreversible destruction of very dangerous weapon systems and Cold War stockpiles. So we've worked in submarine dismantlement, we've worked in rocket motor destruction, we've worked in chemical weapons destruction, we've worked in nuclear warhead security and dismantlement, and we've actually worked very cooperatively, had very good relations with Russian colleagues and friends, including Ministry of Defense and Ministry of Energy and all. But we've raised all the critical questions. And I at one point had 50 full-time employees in Russia at formerly closed and top secret weapons stockpile sites. And we have Green Cross local outreach offices where we do all sorts of seminars and independent environmental analysis and risk analysis and public health statements and on and on and on. But today we have three full-time employees as opposed to 50. And the reason for that drawdown has really been pressure from the Russian government, sometimes from the regions, but mostly from the federal government in Moscow, that they really do not want open discussion about these issues at all. And this also reflects Oleg's comments as well. And we know that all of these issues we're dealing with, in many cases, are extremely high-risk, contentious, controversial issues with potentially extremely dangerous, as we see in Fukushima, very dangerous economic and social and environmental and public health implications and human rights implications as well. So I think my general sense is that the Russian government today, not Russia in general, because a lot of the Russians, a lot of our colleagues are just wonderful, wonderful people and want to do what we all want to do, have a safe and secure world. But the Russian government and the Kremlin just does not want to hear any of this at all. And I think the pressure is coming from, in this particular case, from the Russian government, the federal government, to a large extent. It's hard to stereotype it across the board, and it's also coming from economic pressures. I think Oleg spoke to this too. Particularly when we deal with nuclear power issues, we know that nuclear power is very related to nuclear weapons. We know, for example, that countries that want to do the full nuclear fuel cycle, like Russia, like Japan, like South Korea, like Iran, like India, are all basically quietly seeking the opportunity potentially in the future to have nuclear weapons. They don't want to hear, these countries do not want to hear that at all. They feel it's too dangerous and risky, and the companies selling these big industrial processes, including power reactors and research reactors, don't want to hear it either. So pressure's coming not only from government, but it's coming from corporate actors like Westinghouse and General Electric and Areva and Rosatom Areva in France and Rosatom in Russia and the like. It's just, it's a very unhealthy and potentially extremely dangerous attitude. So that's what we're operating under.
Thank you, Paul. I'm just, in the last, how long do we have? 15 minutes? I wanted to sort of discuss and open up the discussion about what are the strategies for dealing with this. The strategies that I've put here are strategies that we've been exploring in the Human Rights Funders community. Some of these might be very relevant to you, some of them less so. But I have tried to think here, particularly, what are the strategies that might be relevant to you? The ones that I haven't listed here are some of the ones that you're probably engaging with every day but need strengthening. So it will be any strategies, any measures that you're taking in terms of protection, security risks. I know certainly with human rights defenders, there's a huge gap in terms of the funding and resources available for doing that work. So even though there are organizations like Frontline Defenders and Protection International who work with many of the activists that we fund, there's not enough of their resources to go around to plug the gaps. There are organizations out there doing work around digital security, and that might be a resource that some of you are already using. I don't know the degree to which environmental actors are plugged in to those resources in the way that human rights defenders are. So there's also legal defense, and I know there is a legal defense fund that was set up for environmental actors to face these threats. But you might have a better idea of what resources are out there, and one of the things that, very concrete things that could come out of this session is for people to share the resources that are available, so that you all know what is there if you need help. But these are some of the kind of broader sort of meta strategies that human rights funders and activists have been discussing. The first one I mentioned earlier, the development agenda. And given that so much of the work that all of you now do in the room comes under one of the Sustainable Development Goals, this is an opportunity for you to use the new goals as a framework to hold your government to account. So as they try and shut down your activity, for you to be able to raise, both at the national level but in the international arena, how your government is closing down your work and as a result won't be able to deliver on these goals. And actually, I think with the new set of goals, unlike the previous, which were predominantly developing countries, all countries are now required to sign up to the Sustainable Development Goals. The second is unlikely allies. This is a particularly problematic one in the context of the work many of you do, but one of the things we've been looking at is where we've seen economic actors starting to speak out in support of civic space. So somewhere like India, in November of last year, the governor of the Reserve Bank of India actually raised concerns that the closing space for debate and dissent was actually going to impact economic prosperity and growth. I'm not saying that we work very closely with economic actors, and there's always the danger of being co-opted, but what we're starting to see is a number of enlightened business leaders realizing that the closing space is going to create a context that actually undermines stability, sustainability, accountability, and also their reputations. I think the challenge that you face is that many of the economic actors that you're dealing with, extractives industry, nuclear industry, are not public facing. They're not the garment and textiles companies who will succumb to consumer pressure in a particular way. But for example, somewhere like India, what we are trying to do is unpick the government narrative that all civil society is anti-economic and see if we can bring some of those allies on board in the garment and textile sector, for example, to say, actually, not all of us, business is not a homogenous group, and we don't all think the same way, and some of us actually have a long-term view. So just very quick example, in Cambodia, 2013, government was cracking down on labor rights activists. You had a bunch of US, South Korean investors who asked the government to bring the protest to a swift end. Military were brought in for garment workers were killed. A couple of weeks later, you had a group of garment and textile companies, H&M, Puma, Adidas, a number of others, who then sent an open letter to the government saying, stop the violence, we back the call of the workers for an increase in the minimum wage, and the violence stopped. It's not a magic bullet, but it's worth exploring, and I can share with you more resources of business and human rights groups that are exploring this. Third, challenging the unintended and the intended impact of counterterrorism laws. And this, where I was talking about this global body that works on countering terrorist financing, we're pursuing a relationship with them. But one of the things we're also starting to think about as human rights funders, and we don't have any answers to this, is how do you challenge the very vague way that governments are defining security risks and terrorism in a way that it includes the work many of you do. So it's not so much a strategy as an area that needs more work, and we within the human rights community would very much like to partner with environmental activists on how to think through how to respond to this. The fourth is about strengthening and diversifying counter-narratives. And I think, so, if you look at some of the labels that government use, it will be, NGOs are corrupt, they're not accountable, they're political, they're linked to terrorism. And, what are the counter-narratives to that? I don't have the time to go into detail, but the human rights funders I work with have been doing a lot of work with communication specialists, with people who work around cognitive behavioral change, with journalists, starting to identify what an effective counter-narrative might be. We still have a challenge in terms of how you disseminate that message, but then I go back to the example of India, where when the governor of the Reserve Bank of India spoke out, normally when I follow all the articles on India, and a lot of them are around environmental activists, there's systematic trolling of every online article. And the first time I saw no comments was when the governor of the Reserve Bank of India spoke out, because he's the key ally of the Indian government, and the BJP supporters just didn't know how to respond. So it's really worth exploring this. The one after that, building and strengthening alliances. So what we've seen in terms of where civil society is able to push back, there aren't many examples, but there are a few, and one of those is Kenya. So in Kenya in 2013, the government was trying to introduce a law very similar to the one there is in Ethiopia. And the way the human rights defenders responded, the motivation was President Kenyatta was trying to avoid investigation by the International Criminal Court. So it was a justice accountability issue. But he turned on all of civil society, tried to introduce this legislation to cap foreign funding. And the human rights groups allied with the development actors, and particularly the people, the movement of people living with HIV/AIDS, and mounted mass protests, were lobbying MPs, making the public health case for foreign funding, and basically saying that the government would not have been able to deal with the HIV/AIDS pandemic in the country, and thousands of lives would have been lost if it wasn't for foreign funding. And I think this is an argument that actually those of you who work on, for example, issues around the nuclear industry can make in a way that actually many of the groups we fund on human rights can't. So I think it's about looking at what are the arguments you can use, but then also allying with others. So, you know, a country like Pakistan, there is no environmental or human rights movement, but there are activists coming through. But if they were going to respond to legislation, they cannot do it alone. So one of the things I would please ask you to do is think about reaching out to the human rights and development and humanitarian actors in your country who you may not realize are experiencing this phenomena in the same way. The final point is around strengthening resilience. And this comes back to what I was saying at the first, is how do we support activists like Oleg, like Golden, to continue their work until such points as the space might reopen? And that's the question I'm going to sort of throw out to you. So we have just under 10 minutes. I'm not going to ask you to speak amongst yourselves, but I'm just going to open it up. And if anyone has a comment, please, if you could just keep it very short so we can take as many comments as possible. But I'd like your ideas on not necessarily these, but either has this kind of triggered an idea, or are there strategies that you're already using that you think others in the room would benefit from hearing about? Okay.
My name is Winfried Hoffmann. Just a comment to the unlikely allies. So from my point of view, I have been working 40 years in industry. When I heard that NGOs fighting against nuclear power, they get the answer from those governments, don't disturb the welfare of our country because we need that. And just to give you 2 data points, which maybe would be much more powerful instead of using the very correct environmental issues, but real economic issues. And just 2 data points. In Great Britain, there is Hinkley Point. 2 brand new reactors should be built from the French people. And the payment they agreed was 11 cents per kilowatt hour for 35 years, with each year adoption of the inflation, which is more than a photovoltaic plant without any subsidy in Germany, which produces electricity at 8 cents a kilowatt hour. Second data point, Hungary. And they are asking the Russian people to get a new reactor and also most of the financing. And only the investment for that Hungarian nuclear plant is 5.2 euro per installed watt, which comes then only the investment at something like more than 8 cents a kilowatt hour. And then you still need all the fuel elements and reprocessing and whatever. So use the economic argument to fight against that, and then at least your government cannot blame you any longer that you are against the welfare of the country.
Thank you. That's very useful. One of the things we have been exploring is making the economic case. That's a very valuable example.
India,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, my name is Ulrich Eichelmann. I'm a nature conservationist. I'm not completely convinced that my point is the right place here, but I just wanted to raise that issue. These points and what has been discussed, include the economic values and stuff. For me, they're very pragmatic approaches. They're all right in a certain way, but I can speak for nature conservation. We've never been so unsuccessful in the entire human era than we are now. We are losing biodiversity at a loss never seen before. We are losing nature never seen before on the planet. So, and at the same time, we have these big NGOs, and I was working 17 years for WWF with enormous amount of people in it, and they feel all very successful. Why don't we, that's a little bit of a advocato diabolo, why don't we ask all the international NGOs to delete themselves? To stop, because we've been so, including us, so unsuccessful. We feel that we are so great and, we have to improve here, work with corporations. It's a very pragmatic approach. They're not threatening of us. They're not threatened of us. So why not we think more radical? That's my point. Think on a certain layer, on a certain level, to be much more radical. All the successes in history have been created mostly by individuals, by movements, not by, these pragmatic things we're living in. We're living in such a pragmatic life and in a society, and we are discussing within these criteria. We will never succeed, never. So what my point is, although I don't have an answer, correct answer, let's think on a certain different layer to be much more radical. And not so pragmatic, what our cooperation we can deal with, the bank managers, yeah, nice. But in the end, shit, we lose.
Well, right? I'd say the thing is,
Thanks.
You're right and you're wrong. So this operates at two different levels. One is the work that you actually do. So for example, at the fund, what we do is we fund grassroots organizations rather than INGOs, because that's where we think the difference is going to be made. And so this isn't about determining the parameters of that work. This is about keeping the space open so they can take radical action. So giving an example of India, those 9,000 protesters who were arrested, they are not foreign funded. Their space is their space has been closed a lot longer than the space of the NGOs. But the reason we're trying to keep the space open for the NGOs using some of these strategies is those are the NGOs that are documenting the violations. Those are the NGOs that are then bailing those activists out and providing them with legal support. Those are the NGOs that are doing, and I'm talking about national level NGOs, not international ones. So when we talk about this issue, this perhaps kind of misrepresents the breadth of the conversation that's taking place. But what we're trying to do is keep the space open from anyone from an individual to a mass movement to do their work. And so when you look at these sort of strategies, the activists that we fund in India are not trying to have a good relationship with their bank manager. What they're seeing is if the governor of the Reserve Bank of India speaks out, it suddenly reopens a space for them to engage in advocacy with people who might be able to influence the government. But they are simultaneously engaged in mass protests and rallies and trying to mobilize local actors. So it's a twin-track approach. It's not one replacing the other, if that makes sense. But we can talk more about that later. Yes.
Here. Is it working? Yeah. So what we heard about this talk was a lot about confrontation. And I think we cannot run this planet with the spirit of confrontation. So what is needed, we have to think, how do we organize cooperation? And for that, we need methods which create cooperation among us. These methods are available. We have to learn about it. I put one example outside of the door. You can look there because it will take too long to explain here. But I would say the important thing is we have to start, how do we cooperate effectively? And there are methods for that.
Okay, there's already two. But I also think it's about who you're cooperating with, because part of what we're looking at is you're cooperating with other civil society allies who share the same values and goals as you. Okay, sorry.
I actually have an idea, but I would like a clarification first.
Sure.
In terms of the murders, the deaths that's been happening, where has it been coming from? The higher up, or are there people who are actually going out, like regular people, passerby citizens who are causing these murders and harmful, like the person in Honduras who died? Was it from the government who sent to kill, or was it someone who murdered him?
I think it's a sort of what we've often seen with the activists that we're funding who are threatened, it's business interests, hiring people to do the work, but often with government complicity. So it's not that governments don't know that it's happening, but it's not sort of members of the public. That you'll see more in the context of where the drivers of the closing space are things like xenophobia and fundamentalisms. But I think with environmental, you're looking at a mixture of corporate and government complicity.
Well, I think in that case, for people to actually go out and do this, I would like to assume that part of it is because they don't fully, there's a mentality which allows them to think that it's okay to do this. And I think to fix that, we need to start more at the bottom with the children, with the youth, because I think once this mentality is established, it's much harder to get them out of it, and it's much easier for people to then be able to hire them or for them to go out and actually, because even in terms of things that we may be seeing good as nuclear, some like France working in nuclear energy, whereas other countries think it's not a good idea, and both are trying to look at a good thing, a solution for sustainability, but at the same time, in the process, there is that conflict there. And I think once you have this mentality that is established early on, it's much easier. So I think one of the strategies we can use is actually start looking at the people who can be hired, looking at the people, because if we look around, everyone here, I think, has the best interests at heart and has a similar mindset as to what the solutions might be. But the people who are actually committing these acts which are threatening the NGOs, I think they need to be seen, especially at a younger age when they can be more influenced. And in terms of government and higher up corporations, as much as I don't think it's the best in a way, I think it is practical to think that governments and organizations tend to have their best interests at heart. And I think until we find a way to negotiate in a way that they can see an interest for them, it's much easier for them to sideline or undermine the NGO's support. And I think in the process of finding that, what can help governments and so on see that there is a benefit for them, and then secure a permanent treaty or something which allows them to not narrow this space for as much as possible, so that it's in the space that we have that they are not allowed to actually close the space. We can then broaden from there.
Okay. I mean, I think, look, you're not a homogenous group. There are going to be different strategies and different approaches that you're going to be exploring. Some of those are going to be very slow burn. Some of them are going to be around changing mindsets. Some of those are going to be around taking direct action. Mina Kai, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Association and Assembly, always brings out the example of the anti-apartheid movement and said, you know, that people weren't sort of checking to see whether the anti-apartheid activists were registered and whether they were complying with local legislation. You know, there's a space for all of these approaches, but I guess you as a community have to work out what are the ones that work for you, but also how you can use perhaps some of those strategies simultaneously. I know we've run out of time. I did want Golden, actually, if you could just talk very briefly about your experience and what you think would make a difference somewhere like the DRC in keeping the space open for the kind of work that you do. I think this will probably be the last comment.
I'll try to be short. Every time I'm in front of people like you, I feel I'm not alone. Yes, I'm Golden Misabiko from Congo, DRC. When you hear what is happening in Congo, DRC, when you read, you will see how terrible things are happening in that country, how women are being extremely abused, how children are being used as child soldiers, how this country is poor because of a mismanagement of natural resources, because of lack of good governance in politics and in all aspects of life. Yeah, I just want to say that it is in this environment that I heard a call, to say that I have to stand up and be doing something to protect the people, to promote human rights, and to monitor human rights abuses. Yes, when I'm standing in front of you here, I feel I have three faces. One face is of a person who was called to denounce, to promote democracy and human rights. And on the other face, I am this human rights who went through all these ordeals, being arrested, being promised to be killed, and then the next day being beaten, tortured, bleeding all over. This is the second phase. The third phase is when I'm standing in front of you, I feel I am that person, that individual who benefited from the actions, urgent actions of international organizations like Amnesty International, like Human Rights Watch, like Frontline Defenders, like all those. So when I face this third phase, I feel strong. I feel I'm not alone. I'm with you because as we are together, as we build a network all over the world, we can come with the strategies to get a person or to get one of us who are in danger, like the way I used to be, the way I used to be in Congo, to get one of us out of a prison by using some urgent and concrete strategies. Can you imagine that when I was waiting to be killed, it was at the time Madam Hillary Clinton, please pass this message to her. It was at the time she was visiting Congo, and on her agenda, there was something. But because of my being in a prison that time, waiting to die, she changed the agenda. The first on her agenda was the women who are being abused in North Kivu. That was her first agenda, or our first point on the agenda. The second point on the agenda was free Golden Misabiko now. And the third point was good governance or whatever. So I think we can do something.
Thank you, Golden. That's so powerful. And it's what I'd like you to think about over today and tomorrow is one, starting off with very concrete ways, concrete actions that can be taken to protect the security of environmental activists and members of your community who are at risk right now. Paul shared with me yesterday a joint statement that the Right Livelihood Laureates produced for Berta Cáceres. And you might want to think about a joint statement from the laureates, but also perhaps a broader statement. But I guess you would need to think about who the target would be for a broader statement around the space for environmental rights activism. And I hope to continue to work with Virginia and colleagues as you're exploring these strategies. We'll share the thinking that we're doing, but I hope that we'll be able to collaborate together, particularly on the point that Golden raised, which is around the importance of alliances and activists not having to face this phenomena alone. Thank you, Virginia.
Poonam, thank you so much. This has been extremely insightful and informative, and there's a lot of work out there to be done. So we will also look forward to staying in touch with you and seeing what we as environmentalists and you as environmental laureates can do to help, and especially to get the word out, because the word is not out. So we will see how we can do something strategically, constructively. So thanks for joining the session. Now there's a coffee break. We're a little bit late. And after the coffee break, so I probably, let's say 10 minutes to 11, back in here for the class, if you're coming to the class, on advocacy and campaigning, Dennis from Agenda in the Netherlands is going to be leading that class. Again, thanks, Poonam.